So at the moment, we have our service. We've got our donut list with all of our donuts, which are then hard-coded inside of our ng on init. So to move one step closer to a database-driven application, which is what we're going to end up with, we want to start this move of getting our data from a component and putting it into a state service. So for this, we're going to take our array, we're going to then inject our service, and then this is going to make our donuts available in both of our components. And we can test this out as we go. So before we go any further, let's take our array. We can then create a donuts property. Now we're going to give this the type of donut, so we can import our models above, and array. We can then assign it the value of our data structure. For now, we can leave things as is. If you wanted to, you could assign this in the constructor, or you can assign it on the property as we are doing. Now, because we're going to later move this data into a database, it doesn't really matter where we keep it for now. So if we save this out, we now have a service with some state attached to it, which is great for us and being able to then use this state in multiple places. So jumping into our donut list component, the next question is how do we make the data available inside our list? Now for this, we're going to go back to our app component, and instead of donut single, we can then change this over to our donut list. We then see our items being printed out. But of course, this data is then coming from our component because we haven't saved it. Now, if we change this to an empty array, we then see our ng if else kick into effect and we have no donuts here. So what we want to do is take our service and basically inject it into our component. So how do we do this? This is part of Angular's dependency injection system. And the way that we do this is by using our constructor, which is why this ng on init lifecycle hook is important to basically split things out. A key thing I like to remember is use the constructor for wiring things up and using ng on init for things such as initialization and data fetching. So how do we get this constructor to accept our service? Now Angular uses TypeScript for this. So we essentially need to declare the class that we in fact want. So this is a practice where we could say private and we can say donut service. So we're essentially saying our donut list component, when it gets instantiated, we need to ask Angular to provide us, and that's why it's called a provider, an instance of this donut service. So now if we start to type donut service, you can see that we have our auto completion. We can hit enter. If we jump up the top, we then have our donut service being handed to us. So Angular is going to wire all of this up for us. So instead of initializing things as an empty array, we can say this.donut service, and because we have this .donuts property, we can simply just reference it and then hit save. So this then takes our state, which is inside of our service, and simply makes it available to us inside of our component. So what's great here is if we clicked on one of these items, later in the course we're then going to root through and actually bind some click events, and we'll navigate through to that particular item by itself and fetch the data dynamically. But it means that once we have the data, we don't need to request it again because we're going to be able to use this service, which means in our donut single, instead of requesting the data on every single page transition, we can check if it already exists inside of our array. So let's go into our donut single. We can say private donut service is again of type donut service. This then grabs the import for us and makes it available to our component. But of course, we have a single item here. So how do we essentially manage this? We want to look up that particular item by its ID. So let's take our ID, and for now we'll just store it up here. So we can imagine that we've clicked on a specific item. You can take any ID that you want, as long as it exists in our initial data set. So what we want to do, instead of using an object, we want to go and find that item from our service and then simply render it. So here we can say this.donutService.donuts, and there's a couple of ways we could do this. I'm going to use the array find method. This then we can supply a function. You can see here that TypeScript is giving us the type. So here we have value and donut. Now I'm going to call this donut, and we can type it if you like. It is of course optional, but I like to be quite explicit with my types. Now because we are iterating through each particular donut, we want to look at the donut.id and then match it against our ID above here. So this is then going to iterate through all of our particular items. Now when we hit save, we're going to see a TypeScript error. You can see that type donut or undefined is not assignable. So why is this happening? This means that our array find might actually not find it. So how could we provide a fallback? We could say, I want to specify an object otherwise, and we can do this using the OR operator. So by supplying an empty object, we're actually going to see our form being initialized. So this is something interesting, and we'll fill out our object properties and have a look. So let's start this off with name. We can then say icon. We can then say price, give it a default price of 0. We can also add a description property, which will then be an empty string. So if we do not have a donut, we're essentially going to be then creating a donut, right? Because we are in search of a new definition. Because we do not have any matches, so then we can assume that we've then pressed something like create instead of clicking on a particular item in our list. But we have an error at the moment. We have property ID is missing. So sometimes our donut's going to have an ID, but if we're going to create one, we don't have an ID because this gets generated for us, which means if we jump into our model, we want to now make our ID optional. Sometimes we have it, sometimes we don't. When we're creating a new item, we don't have it. We can then close this off, save things out, and we now have the ability to go and grab an existing donut from our data set because our data is then hard-coded in the service as a donut array. We can then go and find it using our ID of any of these items that we want. Otherwise, we're going to supply an empty object, which is then going to initialize the form that we just built. So let's test this out. Let's go to our app component, change things back to donut single. So this is then going to give us a donut single, and we're going to later change this over to the router in our application. But now we have our state, which is now being driven from our application. And if we were to add an ID that doesn't exist, this is then going to initialize our form as completely empty. You can see that we then get those defaults. Promo is selected, new, limited, we can add some data, press create, and off we go. So we're going to learn how to go full circle, use the same form for creating new items, but also if we have an existing item, and what we could in fact do is go and grab another ID, such as the glazed fudge one, replace this, save things out, and we then have a different object. Again, we can go through, grab a caramel swirl, change our ID, we then go and find it, and Angular renders this out for us. So this is a great way that we can then start to move our state out of the components into a service. And I'm showing you this up front because this architecture is scalable. Yes, it might seem like a bit more hard work or a bit of an extra work, but this is going to make your applications bulletproof. You're going to be able to test your code so much more easily. You're going to refer back to it. You're going to understand everything that's going on. And once we're finished with this application build, you're going to end up with a very nice, clean application example that you can use for years to come.